Hello, welcome to Press TV's news analysis. I'm Webster Tarpley. EU leaders set hope the meeting by heads of other world major economies at the G20 summit this week would be on an optimistic note. But the stunning call by Greek Prime Minister George Papandreou of a national referendum on aid packages sent shockwaves in the financial markets. What is the bottom line with Greece? Will it receive the bailout money or will it default? And how will Euro countries come up with the money when they were the ones who were at fault for the mess in the first place? PressTV News Analysis will try to get to the bottom to those questions.
The world's big economies are to get together again to discuss the global economy, especially the debt crisis in the Eurozone. Debt-ridden Greece is to top the agenda of the talks. Ahead of the two-day summit due to begin on Thursday, European leaders held emergency talks with the Greek Prime Minister George Papandreou. They wanted him to explain his surprise decision to hold a referendum on the bailout deal that the IMF and the EU agreed on last week. Amid public anger and ongoing anti-government protests and strikes, Papandreou announced a referendum on the rescue package on Monday. Some critics slammed the deal and warned that the Greek will get poorer with the proposed unpopular package, which will lead to tougher austerity measures.
Historically, it's very clear that wherever the IMF goes, those countries go down the tube. This has been historically the case, whether it's in South America, Far East, or Africa.
The European Union has also raised fears about the stability of other heavily indebted economies like Italy and Spain. Italy, the Eurozone's third largest economy, is widely criticized for the slow and erratic way it has adopted in implementing the reforms it has promised to bring its budget into balance. In Spain, despite a series of austerity measures announced by the government, economists are doubtful if Madrid will finally be able to dig out of its debt problems and also help the Eurozone escape from the debt trap. US President Barack Obama, who is also expected to attend the G20 summit, has voiced concern that the EU debt crisis threatens to spiral into global financial contagion. This while the US economy is in shambles, with growing public criticism about inequality and the unemployment scourge ravaging the country. Latest data shows no significant improvement in private sector jobs in October. The data on October job creation reflects the sluggish pace of the US economic growth earlier this year. Given the current economic uncertainty and the sharp fall in most markets of G20 countries, it is not clear if member states can propose any viable solutions to avoid a recurrence of a global recession.
Well, let's see if we can get some solutions in this news analysis. Let me introduce our guest. Director of the Burgess Group, Robert Olds, joins us from London. We have author of Surviving the Cataclysm, Webster Tarpley, joining us from Washington, and the Secretary General of CEPI Foundation, Paolo Raffon, who joins us from Brussels. Welcome, gentlemen. Paolo Raffon, first to you. Since you were in Brussels, EU leaders lauded their achievement there to have halved Athens' debt burden. They said they have bolstered its bailout fund and have laid down plans to shore up its banks. I'm confused. It's still unclear how they will do that when they themselves are pretty much out of money. I mean, the question is, where is the money going to come from?
That's a very good question. Actually, as you have seen after the announcement of these solutions, there has been a quest to China to contribute to the European fund that has been created a few days ago to save the states. As a matter of fact, I think that most of the decisions that have been adopted are half measures. So basically, they want to show that something is being tackled, but they do not have very much clear what should be done, for how long, and what is the purpose finally of all what they're doing. So I'm quite pessimist on the overall approach that the European leaders are having on this matter.
And looking from the outside in, I mean, what are we looking at here? Just a change in geography? We go from Brussels and then the G20 in France. I mean, what are they going to achieve there that they couldn't achieve back in Brussels and maybe even in the prior G20 meetings since the financial crisis broke out all the way through to here? Paulo Rafael.
Well, the G20 is well known to be a very ineffective type of club of nations. So most probably they will come out with very vague statements. In fact, they have no enforcement capacity from the G20 level. So there will be discussions, some statements, but no operational solution. So I do not expect much either from the G20 in Cannes.
Webster Tarpley, it appears the eyes of European leaders on many fronts are on China. Basically, European leaders looking for someone to pay the bills for obviously what the current mess looks like. How do you think China is going to respond? And of course, China has been critical of Europe and the U.S. I mean, why should China contribute to stabilize Europe?
I hope the Chinese will have the good sense to stay out of this, because I think this is it's a loser, it's a turkey. Concerning the G20, the one positive thing they should and must do is to enact a Tobin tax, a Wall Street sales tax, a securities transfer tax, or financial turnover tax. It should be much larger than the one that they're talking about. It should be 1%. That's the demand coming from Occupy Wall Street under tremendous mass pressure here in the United States. The 1% Tobin tax or Wall Street sales tax is now the order of the day. We've got a general strike going today in Oakland, California, with, I believe, that is one of the demands. And tomorrow, for sure, there's a worldwide day of action led by National Nurses United and a whole bunch of unions attached to the Socialist International who are demanding some version of the Tobin tax. The important thing is that it not be microscopic, and that, of course, the money has to go into the treasuries of the nations. This is not money for the penguins or the polar bears or the rainforests. It's got to be to save the lives and labor power of people in these advanced countries. I would say the Greeks would be well advised to say no. They should vote no on this austerity package. Austerity does not work. Budget austerity that claims to balance a budget is simply a lie. And that's true from Brüning in Germany in the 1930s to Schwarzenegger in California to Papandreou and Socrates and the rest of the IMF people in Europe. It doesn't work. You can destroy the country, but you cannot pay the debt. The bondholders, the private bondholders, are eager to take a 50% haircut as long as they get 50% back, because they realize that their worthless derivatives, when thrown on the market, will be worth even less. So they're asking for a haircut because they know that that paper on the market is worth even less. I would say the Greeks have to consider the examples of Mexico, Argentina, Brazil. You declare a unilateral debt moratorium. That is no reason to leave the euro. Here in the United States, in the Panic of 1837, we had half a dozen states go bankrupt. Nobody ever thought they would leave the American Union because they went bankrupt. What does that mean? If it's the Europe of the banks and the cartels and the hedge funds and the speculators, then that would make sense. But that's not the Europe that people want. They want the Europe of the peoples, and in that case, the Greek question has to be solved. The bailout is not a bailout of Greece. It's a bailout of German and French banks who have foolishly gone into this business of derivative speculation based on Greek bonds. So the basic approach to solving the depression that ought to be enacted, not likely to see much of it, but is to reduce the amount of fictitious capital that is crushing the productive economy of the world, and on the other side, gear up productive investments with a real recovery program, something along the lines of the New Deal, the Lend-Lease program, or the German theoreticians, Wojtyński and Lautenbach in the early 1930s, who talked about doing that.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about what types of recovery programs, if any, really, of any substance has been introduced. Let me bring in Robert Olds into this. I'd like to go on a little bit longer with that wanting of European leaders on going after China. Traditionally, wasn't it the United States that EU leaders would look to? I mean, China, of course, would love for the U.S. to stop printing money if it would cooperate in Europe. Would it make headway maybe in this area? Of course, at the same time, the U.S. would love for China to allow its currency to strengthen more rapidly.
Well, your previous speaker was correct that China would be well advised to stay out of it. The answer isn't really to seek more money to keep the euro afloat, to keep the failing single currency alive. really it is the time that Greece left the euro and had an orderly default of its debts, which is inevitable. Greece is bust, but the only way to get economic growth back is for Greece to leave the euro, and then they can stimulate their economy, which they need to do. And another thing, the last thing that's needed is for the Tobin tax and more taxation, which will be passed on to the hard-pressed consumer when people have little money at the moment to spend, and that would just hurt the economy even further. The answer is not for these measures throwing more taxpayers' money at the euro. The answer is to leave. That's the answer to the problems.
Well, it seems like answers to the problems always geared towards more money being thrown in to save it. And Paolo Raffon, is it true that senior European Union policymakers believe what can stop this Eurozone sovereign debt crisis is actually the European Central Bank? Of course, wouldn't that require a policy change to make ECB a lender? Your thoughts on that?
Well, the crisis is a crisis where we are seeing the lack of, I would say, basic governance of the Eurozone. We have created a currency in a rush, thinking that afterwards this would have settled down and something would have happened for a political and fiscal union that would have been meaningful to sustain it. All this didn't happen. The only effect of the euro over these 10 years has been that of impoverishing the middle class of Europe, which has been confronted with a terrible situation where prices have gone up, their wages have gone down, and now they even risk to lose some of their properties because of the crisis going on. So the situation cannot be handled just by a technocratic institution, which is the central bank. The central bank should be accountable to a certain extent to the people's sovereignty, and this should be expressed through parliaments. For the time being, we are quite far from such a kind of setup in Europe.
Webster Tarpley, trying to understand here why it is that you have on one side the United States blaming Europe in terms of not containing this problem, and then on the other side you have Europe also throwing blame in some sense towards the United States as being at the epicenter of this problem based on the financial crisis. I mean, why is it that you have these two sides blaming each other? What do you read into that? Is it a shifting of blame that's taking place?
If you look at the U.S. policy and the British policy, you'll see that it aims at destroying the euro. It aims at breaking up the euro, provoking a catastrophic collapse of the euro. This is what Christina Romer, her doctoral research and her scholarly research was about how that worked in the 1930s. More recently, people like Summers or Geithner, Bernanke and so forth, their perspective is basically keep the dollar going by smashing up the euro, make the dollar look a little better by making the euro look much worse. And the preferred instrument of attack is the credit default swap, backed up by the politically steered activities of the ratings agencies, as we've seen. So under that attack, and with the help of the London markets, which are wildly deregulated, it's possible to provoke these crises, and that is what has been done. The Europeans needed to ban credit default swaps, to impose heavy penalties on certain forms of speculative attacks on governments. They needed to start raiding the offices of the various credit rating agencies and see what kinds of conflicts of interest and corruption